I don't have time to do the full story, so I'll just read an excerpt. And we'll just read as far as we can go on time. This story doesn't really need too much introduction. As it turns out, since my wife and I have moved to Oregon, we found out that here in the West Coast, this story was never forgotten. But I still don't think it hurts to keep it in the forefront of our minds. It's a dark chapter of our history, the Japanese internment camps in World War II. And so it incorporates my interest in history with my childhood love of baseball. And I kind of intertwine these two stories. And I think it'll be quite clear enough how these two stories interact. The front story is basically a man is looking back on his life. He's received a check during the 1990s as compensation for his time in the internment camps. And he's reflecting back. And one of the stories begins with his birth and moves through the late 1940s to a baseball game that's pivotal in his life. And then the second story that weaves through this is the actual game itself. The title of the story comes from a phrase that the soldiers of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, composed entirely of Japanese Americans, they had a phrase called "going for broke." And that's the title of the story, "Going for Broke." When the check came to reimburse us for what happened during the war, I was more amused than relieved. $20,000. The average pro baseball player makes over $1 million a year now. But it can't be helped. These are different times. For me, what happened after the war was more important. One game in particular. It occurred exactly 44 years ago, in the middle of August 1949, but I can still remember nearly every pitch because there was a Major League scout in the stands that day, and because after that game, everything would be different. In many ways, it was typical. Played against a local all-star team on whatever field we could find, at a high school in Portland, in this case. The crowd spilled out of the bleachers and lined the field on either side, women in high heels with umbrellas, men in suits with hats. It reminded me of the time I had spent in the city 7 years earlier. People pressed against the fence to see how the Army had us living in horse stalls. By the fourth inning, I began to realize I was pitching especially well. The first batter in the inning had grounded out. The second struck out swinging. Now I faced their third hitter. That's when I looked up at the scoreboard and saw all those zeros. In baseball, it's bad luck to think about pitching a no-hitter. So I blocked everything out of my mind except what my father had taught me, to remain balanced, in control, prepared for anything. I went into my windup and fired a fastball, landing with my body square to home plate, ready to field a bunt or a line drive. The batter was a tall, blonde kid with thick forearms, but he couldn't get his bat around quickly enough to connect with my pitch. When Tommy Ishikawa, my catcher, called for a curveball next, I nodded. Not wanting to hang it and let this guy drive it deep, I aimed low, and it tailed away from his swing. As the umpire signaled strike two, someone in the crowd yelled, "Hero, Jack boy!" But I didn't care what he said. I was an American. I reached back and threw so hard, the ball smacked into the catcher's mitt and made a noise that echoed off the bleachers. The batter never moved. The umpire yelled out and jerked his thumb over his shoulder. Tommy pulled off his glove, shaking his hand and rubbing it. I walked off the field and didn't hear a thing the crowd said. I was the star pitcher on the Nisei All-Stars. I wasn't an American. I was born November 13th, 1927, the year the great Babe Ruth hit 60 home runs. Every morning that summer, as I grew in my mother's womb, my father read the sports pages and marveled out loud at the Babe's enormous talent, listening to Yankees games on the radio whenever we could get them in Wapato, Washington, in the heart of the Yakima Valley. Like fallow earth, I accepted the seeds of my father's love of the Yankees and baseball even before I was born. My father had seen the Babe when he was still a pitcher with the Boston Red Sox and played against the St. Louis Browns on his way to a second 20-win season. My father never tired of describing the Babe's ferocious curveball, perhaps because the big man later took part in 2 tours of Japan that helped bring about professional baseball in that country before the war put everything on hold. He would be the best pitcher today if he weren't also the best hitter, my father often told my mother, who became interested in the game when my older brother Frank began playing. Frank was a shortstop like my father, but because I grew quickly and because of my father's early admiration of the Babe, it was determined that I would be a pitcher. As soon as I could pick up a baseball with both hands, I would roll it to where my father stood only a couple of feet away, and he would slowly back up as I learned to roll it farther and farther. When I could hold the ball in one hand, he taught me how to throw, and we would play catch until it was too dark to see. "The boy is too young," my mother protested. "He's going to get hurt." "No, Yakyu will make him strong," my father said. "It will discipline his body and mind." Of course, I was told all this later, after I had indeed grown disciplined and strong because of Yakyu, baseball. My father taught me to prepare for a game the same way we prepared our fields for planting every spring, to believe in the manager and adhere to his strategy as part of the natural order of all things. It was the Japanese way. I am Nisei, second-generation Japanese, and by birth an American. My parents Issei, the first generation, forbidden for years to naturalize. Despite the ocean between them, my father kept in touch with his relatives in Japan, who wrote to him of baseball's growing popularity there. Sitting at our wooden kitchen table with his wire-rimmed reading glasses on, he would sometimes translate for me strange black markings that arrived on wispy paper in thin envelopes. Their lives did not sound much different from ours. The worry of long days in the fields and fluctuating farm prices, the pleasure of baseball on the weekends. But in many ways, my aunts and uncles and cousins remained as mysterious as the language they wrote in. I'd never met any of them. The Babe's tours were my main connection to my father's country. My heroes were the American players like Joe DiMaggio and Dizzy Dean, and I never doubted that one day I would become one of them. Growing up a farm boy during the Depression wasn't as bad as it might sound. As non-citizens, my parents weren't allowed to buy land, but they leased 20 acres on the Yakima Indian Reservation that we kept in potatoes, hops, cantaloupes, and onions. We never seemed to have much money, but we never went hungry, for we also tended a large garden of tomatoes, corn, squash, cabbage, beans, cucumbers, and other vegetables my mother would jar or pickle to keep us through the winter, as well as a flock of chickens and a cow. Besides being a farmer, my father was a baseball star for the Wapato Nippons, who won the Mount Adams League pennant in 1934 and 35. But while I admired his strong throwing arm and the way he hit line drives, there were things I didn't understand about him. He talked of how he hoped to become an American citizen, but he still practiced Bukyu, the Buddhist religion of his father. He meditated every morning and evening, waking up even earlier than I did to perform my chores. He never seemed to get very excited about the game I loved, whether he won or lost. Though there was talk he might be recruited to play for the Seattle Asahis in the Nisei Baseball League, I couldn't tell how much he cared. I looked up more to my only brother, Frank. He was 4 years older than me, and even more than my father, he wanted to be American. Not just legally, which he was, but in every way. He smoked Pall Mall cigarettes and listened to the boogie-woogie and big band music of Lux Lewis and Benny Goodman. And though I'd never been anywhere outside the Yakima Valley, I imagined he could swing dance as well as anyone in Portland or Seattle, maybe even St. Louis or New York. He knew all the movie stars by name. Myrna Loy was his favorite. And he would sneak these calendars into the house with colored drawings of beautiful American women with very short skirts and tight sweaters, or sometimes no clothes at all. Whenever we could, usually on a Sunday afternoon when our chores were light and he wasn't with a steady girlfriend, he would drive us into Wapato to watch a movie and then eat a snack at the drugstore and listen to the jukebox. Frank always ordered a vanilla milkshake with an egg broken into it. We had stopped going to Yakima because they wouldn't let us into the theater, saying our clothes were dirty, even if we hadn't been in the fields that day. But for the most part, we were treated well in Wapato. One time, though, when I was about 12 and Frank 16, he got into a fist fight with an older boy who insulted us in the street. I was already Frank's 5'7", but he weighed 30 pounds more and had 4 extra years of baling straw in his arms. "What did you say?" he asked loudly so that the other boy who had passed us could hear him. The boy turned around and walked back. He was tall, much taller than Frank, and his gums seemed too loose around his teeth. I watched his face turn from pale to bright pink. "I said go back where you came from," he said. "We don't need you here stealing our jobs." "I was born in this country same as you," Frank said, squaring his shoulders, so that for a moment he looked bigger than he really was. "Yellow devil," the boy said in a way that seemed he was spitting at us. Without warning, Frank punched him in the face and didn't let up, pounding the boy while he stood there, dazed. Blood ran from his nose, and a drop of it spattered onto my good white shirt. I watched it run in a small stripe down my chest pocket before soaking in, and my first thought was that our parents would be angry. When I looked up, the boy lay on the ground, Frank standing over him with both fists. "Around here, we call cowards yellow," he said. I forgot all about my shirt then, and only wanted to be like Frank, a tough American kid. We didn't have radar guns in 1949, but I threw as hard as any of the major leaguers. More importantly, I could throw the ball where I wanted it. Going into the bottom of the 5th inning of that game against the local All-Stars, I hadn't even allowed a runner to reach base. Finally, with 2 outs, I walked their shortstop. The crowd cheered like they had just won a pennant. I was still trying not to think too much about my no-hitter, but I couldn't help looking into the bleachers. Earlier that summer, I had thrown a shutout against the Pacific Northwest League champs, and after the game, my manager pointed out a scout for the Brooklyn Dodgers, a stocky man with dark, curly hair who stuck a notebook in his jacket pocket before disappearing in the parking lot. I couldn't help wondering if he was there among all those screaming fans in Portland. We had been told some scouts might be covering the game. To see the white players, I knew, not my team, but I was pitching so well, I thought I stood a chance of being discovered. Japanese Americans weren't allowed to play in the major leagues after the war, an unspoken agreement, but as binding as a contract. And there were no full-time professional Japanese American leagues. We got by playing anyone we could. High school and college teams, town teams, other Nisei teams. Sometimes we played exhibitions against the Negro League ball clubs, though they didn't last much longer after Jackie Robinson finally reached the big show in 1947. We were almost the first non-whites to make it. In 1941, Henry Honda, a Nisei from San Jose, and a pitcher, just like me, signed a contract with the Cleveland Indians. Many of us in the Yakima Valley became excited, especially the players and their families. We were working our field when 2 of my father's teammates, Kenichi Ono and Tsuneo Yasuda, drove up in Kenichi's Plymouth. He jumped out waving a letter from his cousin in California, which he read out loud when my father, Frank, and I joined him. "Do you know what this means?" Kenichi asked when he had finished reading. I wasn't yet 14, but I knew. Someone from our culture had made it. My father, though born overseas, could now show that the seeds he had sown in his new country had taken root and grown deep. He stood with his hands in the pockets of his overalls. Tsuneo reached out and grasped him by the shoulder. "Perhaps Joe will be next," he said. Everyone is talking about how good he is already. My father didn't look at me. Instead, he pulled out his right hand and placed it on Tsuneyo's shoulder, and the two men stood connected like that for a moment. My father's face showed no emotion. "We will see," he said. "We will see." But when he pulled his hand away, I could see it was shaking. Henry Honda never played an inning in the major leagues. On December 7th, 1941, a Sunday, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. They might as well have burned our family farm. Frank and I were drinking milkshakes at the drugstore in Wapato when the news came on the portable Zenith that always sat on the shelf above the blenders. Everyone in the place became quiet, but the soda jerk turned up the radio anyway. Frank quickly pulled some money from his shirt pocket and placed it on the counter. "Come on, let's go," he said. "We're done now." When I tried to finish the last of my milkshake, he took it from my hands and set it down. "Didn't you hear me? I said, we're done." He looked at me hard. Everyone turned to watch us as we put on our jackets, and I felt their eyes burning into our backs as we left. The next time we drove by that store, a sign hung in the front windows. "No Japs wanted." Other stores where we had shopped and socialized put up similar signs. Just like that, people who had been our friends and neighbors and co-workers became distant strangers or even local enemies. It was like being born a second time, only in a foreign land, with different stories in my ears. It's an irony in life that sometimes our most trying times open doors to greater experiences, like threshing wheat to strip away the coarse husks and get to the sweet kernels of grain. It's an even greater irony that sometimes it doesn't work this way at all, that the trying times signal an end to the way of life and the beginning of a long exile. I never wanted to leave our family farm in the heart of central Washington's most fertile valley, the only place I had ever called home. "Shikata ga nai" was all my father said. It can't be helped. Everything happened fast, and the uncertainty of our situation made it seem to move faster. Within a week of Pearl Harbor, my parents' bank account was frozen. Frank, now 18 and with his own bank account, could withdraw money only if he showed his birth certificate. That didn't last long, but then my parents had to turn in our radio at the Wapato police station and register at the post office as enemy aliens. In February, as we prepared for the new growing season, we heard rumors that we would be evacuated into the interior of the country. A month later, a man from the Farm Security Administration told us they would watch our farms and equipment. Taking advantage of sacrifice prices wouldn't be tolerated, he said. It would be considered un-American. But it happened all over the place. Kenichi Ono had just invested $125 in his 1936 Plymouth and only got $25 for it. Tsuneyo Yasuda, who had been among the first settlers in the valley to transform the sagebrush desert into a garden, received a third of what his Alice Chalmers tractor was worth. We simply stored our tractor and truck and potato digger in the barn and housed our animals with the Kavanaughs, a white family up the road who seemed sympathetic. In late May, when we should have been watching our hops vines spiraling clockwise toward the sun, the Army sent in an artillery unit to oversee the relocation of all Japanese Americans in the Yakima Valley, including non-aliens, as they called citizens like my brother and me. Suddenly, we had less than a week to prepare for our leaving. We were told we could only bring what we could carry. We wouldn't be allowed to harvest our crops, and plowing them under would be considered sabotage. On the last day of the month, we were processed in the Wapato Junior High School gymnasium, where I'd gone to school. Other Nisei helped by acting as clerks. Everyone was civil, including the artillerymen. Though they looked fierce with their guns and green fatigues, they were kinder than most of our white neighbors had been since the bombing. One soldier, a corporal named Joe, treated my friends and me especially well, sneaking us chocolate bars and showing us magic tricks, such as making a coin disappear from his hand and then reappear behind his ear. He smiled and mussed the hair on our heads. He said he had an uncle, a businessman, who had visited Japan on a steamship in the 1920s and brought back stories that didn't sound anything like the letters my father read to me, stories of busy market streets, exotic colors and smells, and the most beautiful, polite people on earth. Corporal Joe himself had always hoped to visit one day, and now he was afraid he was going to get his wish. Less than a week later, my family and I were loaded on a train bound for Portland. People clutched suitcases full of clothes, but also crates of books or heirloom china, typewriters, lamps, cooking pots. My mother brought an assortment of sewing tools, my father his Buddhist shrine. Frank brought his collection of big band records, though we had to leave the phonograph behind. I naturally took my baseball equipment. I still believed in the future then, still held on to my father's dreams I had soaked up in my unborn sleeping. Very slowly, though, I woke up and learned to believe what my eyes saw before me. The army had called in the infantry to help herd us onto the train. Kenichi Ono's family was ahead where we stood in line on the platform. An infantryman poked Mrs. Ono in the arm, causing her to drop a framed picture she carried. The glass shattered as it hit the ground, ruining the frame, but Kenichi bent over to retrieve the picture. When he did so, the infantryman shoved him, almost knocking him down. "Giddy up there, old paint," the infantryman said, laughing. He looked around to see if his buddies had heard him, and they laughed too. He then kicked away the picture and its broken frame. "You won't be needing that at the glue factory." Several others were rough as well, and the artillerymen who had watched over us for a week and a half wore tight faces. Some began muttering their disgust so that we could hear them. The infantrymen who had shoved Kenichi boarded the train and began directing people, grabbing them by their arms and pushing them into the first open seats, whether or not they were near their loved ones. When Kenichi and his wife became separated, he protested. The soldier laughed again, though this time without his mocking smile. My, the horse he talks," he said. "Might have to put a bridle and bit on this one." My family was already seated, but I remained standing in the doorway to the car, clutching my baseball mitt to my chest. The artilleryman I knew as Corporal Joe moved past me and up to the other man. Both wore identical stripes on their sleeves. "You're out of line," Corporal Joe said. "Me and my boys don't like what's going on." "Maybe you should mind your own damn business." "Watch your mouth. There are women and children here. I won't have you telling me what to do." He shoved Corporal Joe's shoulder, and Joe pushed back with both hands. They grabbed each other's shirts and began wrestling, each trying to gain an advantage before falling into an empty seat, the infantryman's feet slipping out from under him. Corporal Joe jerked the man up and smacked him hard, sending his head through the window. There was the crash of glass and the faint tinkling of pieces hitting the platform, an excited sound like rain among the soldiers. All of us remained completely silent, though Frank stood up in his seat, his forearm muscles clenching and unclenching. Later, sometimes, I would think of Corporal Joe when I pitched, the ball a coin that disappeared before the batter could hit it. I would think of Frank, something in me rising, causing me to feel taller than I really was. And I think that's a good spot to stop.